Welcome everyone to the first CF Get Loud Town Hall. We are stronger together.
I will fight for you. I always do until
Living with cystic fibrosis is exhausting. We spend hours a day on breathing treatments. So much of our lives from the day that we're born are filled with simply trying to fight the fluid that is building up in our lungs. It is non-stop. But in 2019, history was made in the CF community. A breakthrough medicine is released in the US that is giving patients all over the world a second chance. This medication is called Trikafta. This medicine is a gene modulator that transforms our defective DNA and allows our bodies to function almost as if we don't have CF at all. The lungs stop rapidly filling with fluid. Lung function rises and CF patients are gaining their lives back. The results are astounding. Unfortunately, Canada does not have access to this medicine. We are left behind the 18 other countries across the world that have successfully gained approval for this medicine. We refuse to be left behind. Canada, don't give up on us. Help us fight for Trikafta.
All right. So again, thank you for joining us today. Welcome to what will be an hour in which we hope to educate, elevate, and empower you to better understand the challenges that Canadians are facing as we work towards access to CF breakthrough medicine. Today we have invited advocates, our CF community, MPs, MPPs, MLAs, and journalists from across Canada to provide insight with regards to the struggles Canadians are facing as we work to navigate a convoluted system that seems to provide more roadblocks to life-saving medications than support. Our CF community has been working towards a cure for decades, and we currently have the closest thing to that in Canada's doorstep. Patients continue to get sicker as we fight for our lives in a country that seems to be against us. We have other modulators that were submitted and approved by Health Canada prior to the changes to the PMPRB. However, they too are caught in an endless red tape that is Canada's system. We have invited Canada's top cystic fibrosis physician to explain the power of this new medication, Trikafta, as well as experts on the Canadian drug policies that are severely hindering access to medications. Our goal after today is that you will be better equipped to ask the right questions, to provide responses to the most common excuses, and essentially get these drugs into patients' hands as quickly as possible. We'll have a question and answer period at the end of this, so please submit your questions on the WebEx applet in the chat, and one of our team will be monitoring that and submitting the questions for me to ask our panelists. Again, just please remain muted throughout the presentation. I now have the pleasure to introduce to you Stephanie Stavros, one of the founders of the CF Get Loud movement. Steph?
Hi everyone. So the CF Get Loud Canada story. CF Get Loud Canada was founded by a few patients on IV poles that were fighting for their lives. In October of 2019, hope was ignited in the CF community when Trikafta was approved in the US. We watched helplessly while our friends south of the border were given the opportunity to thrive while we continued to suffer. Immediately, we pleaded on social media for people across Canada to hear our message. We needed everyone to know that the medicine that we have been fighting our entire lives for, the breakthrough is here and it's just out of reach. We made videos. We met with our elected officials. We wrote our local papers. We pleaded on national news outlets and asked for our lives to be saved. In January, this small group of friends got a big win. I was fortunate to be the first person in Canada to be approved for the Compassionate Care Program. Vertex decided to save my life when Canada simply wouldn't. The news went national and so many CF patients wanted to find out, what is this medicine we're all calling a miracle? And why can't we all have it? From that point forward, this group of friends became full-time advocates. Our mission is to ensure that all CF families are aware of the developments that are impacting the CF community, to empower fellow advocates to raise their voices and encourage everyone to tell their story, to join together across Canada, province to province, and get loud united. In just 4 months, our grassroots movement has nearly 4,000 advocates. We have been striding together virtually all towards the same goal. We have felt the heart of our community through a multitude of conversations. We have heard the stories and the heartbreak and the challenges that CF families are facing. We've gone from laughter to tears and back all in one conversation. The political landscape, it changes almost daily, but we're able to move swiftly and adjust accordingly. We are so proud of what this movement has become, and we already feel the increased confidence within our community to raise their voices and get loud every single day. We will continue to educate, elevate, and empower until we reach our collective goal. Thank you for being with us here today.
Thanks, Steph. It always gets me going when I hear you tell a story. I don't think I have any comments. I'm speechless, but moving along, and I'd like to introduce to you our first speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Tullis. She's the director of the Toronto Adult Cystic Fibrosis Clinic at St.Michaels Hospital. Dr. Tullis is responsible for the care of 450 adults with CF, and she has 25 years of experience with CF clinical care. She's professor of medicine at the University of Toronto and the respirology division head at St. Michaels Hospital. Thank you. Go ahead, Dr. Tullis, the floor is yours.
Speaking to an audience that's very familiar with CF, but I think the science is important to understand how really elegant and precise these medications are. I'm going to start with my disclosures because it is important that I have relationships with a number of pharmaceutical companies, the research I do with them, and also in a consulting capacity as well and helping with study design. And these include the company Vertex Pharmaceuticals, which is the manufacturer of Trikafta. So what's CF? Well, this community knows more than anyone else, but just in case there's some people out there that are listening who don't know, there's over 4,300 people with CF living in Canada, and it's a disease that can be characterized as serious, life-shortening, genetic, and fatal. And in fact, every year between 50 and 60 Canadians will die of cystic fibrosis. So this is a condition that is not truly rare. There's over 4,000 people living with CF, but it has still, even with our advancements in therapy and our better survival, still has a significant toll. Now, the discovery of the CF gene, which was a Canadian discovery funded by CF Canada, really launched the new era of therapy. And that was once Lapchi Choi and his colleagues at Sick Kids had discovered the gene, then we could go ahead and understand what the cause of CF was. And until we really understood the basic cause, there's no way that therapy could be directed, targeted. So what we now know is that cystic fibrosis is caused by a defect in a protein called CFTR. And CFTR is basically a channel or a pore, and its job is to conduct chloride, which is a salt, and bicarbonate into and out of cells. The picture on the right shows a sort of a cartoon of what CFTR looks like, where it's sitting in the cell membrane, and there are salt ions going in and out. And the picture on the left gives you an idea of this protein that can open and close to let salt into and out of the cells. And the importance of this is that the movement of chloride impacts how water moves into and out of cells, and the movement of bicarbonate impacts the acidity of the mucus. So basically, CFTR, the secret is what it does is it hydrates or adds water to secretions and keeps them at the right acid-base balance. So what happens is CF involves all of the body. The lungs are, of course, the organ that we talk about the most because the lungs are, damage to the lungs is what causes the premature death in people with CF. And basically, the thick mucus in the lungs means that bacteria that we breathe in the air gets trapped in the mucus. And these infection from the bacteria causes ongoing damage and ends to a form of scarring called bronchiectasis. Now, the abnormal mucus is elsewhere in the body, including in the pancreas, and there it causes digestive problems and malnutrition. Now, this is the real crux of things. So here on the picture on the left is that little schematic of what CFTR looks like, and the red dot is the chloride ions going in and out. But in real life, CFTR is more complicated. It's like this three-dimensional structure that is like folded strands of material that form, when you look at it in cross-section, which is the picture on the right, thick walls with a tiny little hole in the middle, and it's through that hole that salt goes in and out. And this mutations in this structure, like the delta F508 mutation, which is shown here, cause this complex structure to fold incorrectly and be the wrong shape so that the channel and the pore doesn't work. And so basically what happens is the body sees a defective CFTR protein and says, whoa, this is no good. And it breaks it down before it can even get to where it needs to get to in the cell to work. So even small defects in the instructions on how to build this complex channel have a major effect. Now, the most common defect is called delta F508 or F508del. And that basically just means a deletion of phenylalanine at position 508 in this long structure. And this leads to misfolding of the protein and early breakdown of the CFTR. So it never really gets to the right place in the cell. If some of the CFTR protein that has the F508del mutation does make it to the right location, the channel doesn't open frequently enough. So there's multiple problems with this, the most common mutation. So what is CFTR modulator therapy? Well, in the past, all our treatments for CF were dealing with the downstream consequences. You know, you have infection, you give antibiotics. You have thick mucus, you give mucus thinning drugs. So you have plugging of the thick mucus in the airways, you do physio. And it all deals with the consequences of CF, not the basic defect. But CFTR modulator therapy are drugs that act directly on that protein to help correct the mistakes that are there so that that complex structure folds into the right position, gets to the right place in the cell, and works. And we talk about different CFTR modulator therapy as correctors and potentiators. And correctors fix the problem with the folding, and potentiators open the channel. So really what we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years has been an evolution in therapy. So for people with the F508del mutation, the first modulator that worked was a combination of a corrector called lumacaftor and a potentiator called ivacaftor, and that combination was called Orkambi. A few years later, there was a slightly better corrector called tezacaftor, along with ivacaftor or Symdeko. And what we're talking now with Trikafta is a combination of 2 correctors, elixacaftor and tezacaftor with ivacaftor. And just like the evolution in our smartphones getting better with every generation that comes out, this is the same thing that's happened with these generations of CFTR modulator therapy, with each subsequent drug having fewer side effects and more efficacy. So why is this important? Well, the F508del mutation is seen in 90% of people with CF in Canada. So if we can fix this mutation really well, then we can help 90% of people with CF. So this is like this one fix for one mutation has a huge impact. So what do the studies show? Well, the phase 3 trials that were presented at the North American Conference last fall and published in the New England Journal of Medicine showed that the combination of these two correctors and potentiators in people with CF with even just one copy of the F508del mutation showed an improvement in lung function of 14% predicted. That's like going from a lung function of 60% predicted to 74% predicted, and those results were seen within 2 weeks. So very rapid improvement in lung function. That was also seen in association with a reduction in the number of chest infections. And even in the relatively short duration of the study of only 24 weeks, there was a 63% reduction in chest infections. And so, I don't need to tell this audience that this kind of reduction means fewer hospital admissions, fewer courses of IV antibiotics. And why it's important for doctors as well is that with each chest infection comes the risk of a decline in lung function. So if people with CF don't have chest infections, they don't have the same number of opportunities for that drop in lung function to happen. The studies also showed improvement in weight and an improvement in quality of life using a standardized measure. So when we look at this drug, it has a profound impact on things that matter to people with CF and their families, things that matter to doctors and healthcare professionals. So where we hope to be, and I really liked my introduction because it took about 5 years off my life, which is always good. And so I've actually been looking after people with CF for 30 years now, but I'm glad I only look like I've been doing it for 25 years. But where the future is going to be for me and other CF doctors is that we'll be able to do newborn screening to diagnose infants with CF. We'll be able to do genetic testing to find out which mutations they have. We'll be able to start them on CFTR modulator therapy that's guided by these clinical trial outcomes. And we'll be able to start therapy early enough to prevent the development of disease, not just treat established disease, which is what we saw in the trials. And then we can add the downstream treatments of inhaled antibiotics and mucolytics as needed. And we'll get to a day when CF is no longer a life-shortening disease. And would have been hard to imagine that when I started doing CF, but this goal is in sight. But to get there, we have to have access to CFTR modulator therapy. Not just the current drugs now, but the pipeline of future drugs that are coming. These drugs work well, but I have no doubt that there'll continue to be improvements. But we have to fight now to get access to these therapies to lead the way so that future generations of people with CF will have access to the drugs as they become better and better. So the science is tremendous. It's a very elegant solution to a problem. But that's not the bit that makes me as a CF doctor excited. We've had experience with Trikafta through the Compassionate Program, which is sponsored by Vertex. And Vertex has identified that people with CF who are over the age of 12 and have severe lung disease and the appropriate mutations in their CF gene may be eligible to start on compassionate therapy. And to date, we have had about 50 people with cystic fibrosis in our clinic who have had access to Trikafta. And it truly has been an unbelievable experience to watch the improvements that we've seen in our patients, to see people who were waiting for a lung transplant come off the lung transplant list. That's happened several times. To see people on oxygen come off oxygen. To see people gain weight who've not been able to gain weight ever, to see that happen. And to see people, being able to do the things that they want to do. And so the science is good, the studies are solid, and the clinical experience supports that. And so now the next step is not just having this medication available for those people with low lung function through a compassionate program, but to move ahead and try and get access to all Canadians with CF who have these mutations. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm excited to be part of this journey with all of you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Tullis. Every time I hear you speak, I'm just amazed at your command for language. It's absolutely impeccable, your ability to communicate such a complex topic and just making it accessible to everybody. I can't stress enough the regard in which patients hold Dr. Tullis. I have known her for the last 14 years since I transitioned to St. Mike's from Sick Kids, and I owe my life to the work that her and her team do every single day. So I'd just like to express my gratitude and respect on behalf of the CF community. Thank you so much. Next, we have Dr. John Wallenberg. Dr. Wallenberg is Chief Scientific Officer of Cystic Fibrosis Canada. CF Canada is a national charitable not-for-profit established in 1960, and as an internationally recognized leader in funding innovation and clinical care, they invest more in life-saving CF research and care than any other non-governmental agency in Canada. Dr. Wallenberg, thank you for joining us today. Over to you.
Thank you, Jacob, and I'm hoping everyone can hear me well. Thank you. This is a great opportunity. You've got a massive crowd. It's wonderful, and I really appreciate it. So I was asked to talk a little bit about the history. So bear with me, folks. I'm going to be way more boring than Dr. Tullis. That's not hard. I mean, she's such a wonderful speaker. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk very briefly just about a little bit of history. So as Dr. Tullis was talking about, these drugs called CFTR modulators, they're a class of what we call precision medicine. And Trikafta is really the third generation of these drugs. The first generation was a drug called Kalydeco. So that was the single molecule that Dr. Tullis was talking about called ivacaftor. And that was good for a very small percentage of the cystic fibrosis population. And the second generation was then the combination of the two drugs like Orkambi and Symdeko, which is a two-drug combination. And then this is the third generation, and it's the triple combination. What I'm going to do is I just want to talk a little bit about, I'm going to go back a little bit in history just to talk about how these drugs get approved. I'm not going to go through the health technology assessment process. Chris is going to talk about that a little bit later, but I will talk very briefly about certain steps. So first, the drug gets submitted by the manufacturer to Health Canada to show, for demonstration that it's safe and can be used in patients in Canada. It would then go through this sort of health technology assessment that Chris will talk about, and that body will make a recommendation to the public system whether that drug should be included in the formulary or not. If it's approved and recommended for inclusion, it then goes to negotiation for price by a body called the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. And once they come to an agreement, then the provinces look in and can decide whether they're going to include it in their own coverage in their formularies. So just very briefly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the process to sort of explain some of the things about where we are, how we got here, and some of the challenges that we faced along the way and that we may face in the future. So in terms of timelines, Kalydeco was first approved by Health Canada in late 2012, November 26, 2012. 120 days later, on March 26, 2013, so relatively quickly, 4 months, the Common Drug Review, or CADTH, recommended that Kalydeco be listed on the formulary publicly. So it then went to the next step, and it went off for negotiations by the PCPA. In the meantime, about a little over a year later, there were an additional 9 mutations. As Dr. Tullis alluded to, there are a lot of mutations in cystic fibrosis. So the first approval was for one specific mutation and for children ages 6 and above. So in June of 2014, so a year and a half after that first approval, there were 9 additional mutations approved by Health Canada. 10 days after those mutations were approved, the PCPA announced a listing agreement or a pricing agreement with Vertex. So the original drug was going to be approved. It was going to be, they'd finally come to a pricing agreement, and that was 10 days after those mutations. But unfortunately, those mutations that had just been approved weren't included in the negotiations. So on December 14th, when CADTH, the Health Technology Assessment Body, said, oh yeah, these mutations should be included, they weren't actually covered. And so those mutations actually found themselves in some kind of extended limbo. Now, you would be forgiven for asking the question, why did it require additional negotiations? I mean, we were talking about 20 people in Canada. It would be a fair question, and I don't have an answer to that one. Not long after that, so Kalydeco was then made available as of 2014. In 2017, Kalydeco was approved for children aged 2 to 5. So just so everyone is clear, the approval process, the initial, when you're doing the clinical trials, you're first doing it in adults, and so you're getting approval for people in some cases 12 and up. In the case of Kalydeco, it was ages 6 and up. And you need to continue doing clinical trials to ensure, in the younger ages, to ensure that the drug is going to be safe in those younger ages, primarily for the younger ages. So that didn't happen until 2017. And then in 2019, another 2 years, it was approved for toddlers aged 12 to 2. So at that point in time, now we've got coverage or Health Canada approval for everybody from ages 1 on up for Kalydeco. But bear in mind now, we're here at that point. We're talking about an additional 6 years after the first approval. So it's a time-consuming process, and it's multiple steps along the way. Finally, in January of this year, so 6 years after the initial approval, 7 years actually after the initial approval, the regulatory bodies, the PCPA, finally came to a pricing agreements for those 9 mutations. So it took an awfully long time to get there. And one of that stepwise process is actually one of the challenges, and it's one of the reasons, one of the things that Vertex highlights as being one of the appeals of what you might have heard of as their portfolio deals. So when Vertex has made offers, these quote-unquote portfolio deals, their intention there is to say, if we can get approval for the drug under a portfolio agreement, when new mutations are added, they're just rolled in. When there's new ages added, they're just rolled in. So you don't have to go through those kinds of negotiations again. The next one I'm going to talk about, and it's going to be very brief again, is Orkambi. So a lot of what happened with Kalydeco was actually before my time with the organization. Shortly after I joined the organization, we were dealing with Orkambi, and Orkambi was approved by Health Canada in early 2016, January 2016. But when it went for that health technology assessment, that HTA, CADTH, they first gave it a negative preliminary recommendation in the summer of 2016, and we had an exceptional opportunity to be able to speak with them about that before they came out with a final recommendation. And I remember looking at the data, and no, the data wasn't as promising as Kalydeco. You could see that there's a range of responses. Some people responded really, really well to Orkambi, and others not so well. But as a patient organization, you look at it and you say, it's unfortunate that not everybody responds well, but the fact that you're getting individuals who are responding, that's really important because this is an important drug. And when you're seeing benefits similar to what Dr. Tullis was describing in certain individuals, even if it's not everybody, you think to yourself, well, this is important, we got to get it to patients. It's a negotiation point when you go in to talk with the company. There was one other consideration, in fact, in that Kalydeco actually treats a pretty small percentage of the population. It treats about 5% of the population because it's specific for a small set of mutations and they're more rare. Orkambi was indicated for 50% of the cystic fibrosis population because it treats people with 2 copies of that delta F508 mutation, the most common one that Dr. Tullis was talking about. So if you look at the number of people who are going to get a benefit from Orkambi, and you compare it to the number of people who are going to get benefit from Kalydeco, the same clinical benefit, the same increase, an important increase in lung function, even if Orkambi doesn't work very well, but because it affects so many more people, you actually end up helping more people with Orkambi than you would with Kalydeco. So for the healthcare system, I mean, Kalydeco would help about 200 people in Canada. Orkambi would give the same kind of clinical benefit, but to 250 to 300 people. We felt this was a pretty strong argument to approach CADIS with. Imagine our surprise when the recommendation came back and it was still negative. It really sounded to us as though the regulatory bodies were saying, if not everybody can benefit from the drug, nobody can. We're not going to recommend that there's negotiations. And it was incredibly frustrating. And for me, it highlighted that what looks like very rational, very reasonable, and I would say almost really, really obvious evidence to a patient organization doesn't necessarily resonate with the regulatory bodies or the bodies that are negotiating price, which really highlights the need for things like what we're doing today, which is the need for patients to advocate on their own behalf, because we can't really trust the government to do it and we can't really trust the industry to do it. At this point in time, we're now looking at Trikafta. Trikafta treats a much bigger proportion of the population and the clinical benefit is better. So we don't foresee the same kind of challenge that we had with CADIS for approval for Trikafta. However, there are changes coming to the way drugs are being evaluated in Canada. And I think I'm going to stop there because I believe Durhane is going to be talking about some of those changes next and going to be explaining exactly what the implications of those coming changes are.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, John. That was great. I mean, it resonated really strongly with me that sometimes we expect a level of reason, logic, and common sense as part of the process. And I think, like you said, the purpose for this particular town hall is to level set and for those that are listening that could potentially make these changes or work with us to bring these changes forth, to understand really what we're talking about here. You mentioned that Durhane is next, and that's completely right. So up next we have Durhane Wong-Rieger. She is the president and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders. CORD provides a strong common voice to advocate for health policy and healthcare system that works for those with rare disorders. We appreciate the perspective that she has added to the fight, though, and how vocal she has been that all Canadians should feel strongly about it, and that these challenges ahead are not just for the rare disease community or the CF community, but it's for Canadians as a whole. So please, Durhane, on to you.
First of all, while I'm setting this up, I just really want to thank the CF Get Loud group, Cystic Fibrosis Canada, Chris McLeod and his group, because as a community, you folks have been absolutely outstanding in terms of advancing access for therapies. And certainly, I mean, you've got your around the CF therapies, but as you know, and as Mo has said, it is on behalf of everybody, and it's not just rare diseases. So I really appreciate that. And I've really appreciated also the opportunities of being able to work with people like John Wallenberg over the years. So what I've been asked to do is to provide you with a little bit of a background on something that I think most of you who are on this webinar have probably been involved in all along, and that is really calling for the changes to the pricing agency to be pulled back or to be shut down. And what I've been asked to do is provide you a little bit of more depth in terms of why these regulatory changes are so dangerous. So hopefully I can get to the next slide. So the PMPRB, which may be something that you folks have now gotten used to as an acronym, stands for the Patent Medicine Prices Review Board. And it really is that. They are a they're a federal agency, so they're funded entirely by the federal government. What their mandate is actually quite narrow. They were set up to protect Canadians from excessive drug prices. So they're not to set what is the best price. They're not to set what is the right price or what is an affordable price, nor are they to really take into context what the healthcare system would provide. Their job is to make sure that Canada doesn't pay more than what would be considered to be a fair price. Now, that's a little challenging in saying what's a fair price. Well, there are, a couple of things that were actually used as benchmark. One originally was that, okay, if we're paying no more than what other countries like us are paying, then that would be fair. So there was a group of 7 countries that the Canadian prices were actually benchmarked against, and you couldn't sell for more these other 7 countries were selling for. And that was a one way, or at least what their list price was. So as many of you may know, there is a list price, which is kind of like when you buy a car, right? I always think about it as a used car. There's a sticker price. And then what we know is that, unless you're an absolute, kind of wealthy or hopelessly, I was going to say a fool, but I don't really mean that. Nobody would actually pay the sticker price. What you expect to do is go in and negotiate the price. But there is a sticker price, and that is the maximum price. You can't list it for more than that. What happened in 2017, 2018 was that the PMPRB came forth with some proposed changes in their regulatory authority. So these are the regulations that say, okay, here are the powers that you PMPRB have. And what they did were 2 very important things. One is they say, okay, those countries that are in that basket of 7, as we call them, include some of the highest priced countries in the world. And those are the USA and Switzerland. We all know that the US pays a great deal for drugs, and that's an aberration of the US system. It also is based on the fact that most drug discovery, most of the benefits in terms of the industries go to the US. They also have a highly segmented private drug insurance program. So they end up actually being first to get new therapies, getting most of the profits that come out of therapies because the company's there, but also then end up paying much higher. The same in terms of Switzerland, which also has a very independent drug review system and a drug reimbursement system. So the goal is, okay, let us make sure that we are not going to be more than what we call the OECD countries. So let's look at this basket of countries that are comparable to us, and we will then make sure that our drugs are going to be about the middle of those. So the PMPRB regulations were changed to say we will drop the 2 most expensive countries. We were at 5 lower priced countries. That would put us to the median of this basket of countries. This was somewhat different. But I think most people didn't disagree with it. In fact, some of us had already considered the fact that the US and Switzerland were not good comparators. We should not be paying certainly what the US and Switzerland were paying. And there was not much controversy around it. In fact, by changing this basket of countries, it automatically meant that the list price, the maximum list price of drugs in Canada would drop about 20%. So that's the starting negotiation price, right? So we would automatically be about 20%. It also becomes the starting price for private drug plans. So the private drug plans would actually get an automatic 20% reduction in terms of the maximum price that they would be paying. The public drug plans would have a 20% reduction in the starting negotiation price. So this is what happens. Now, as you heard from John, the way in which we get to the actual price is the same as you do when you go into a car dealer. You negotiate. And part of that negotiation is based on what John also mentioned and what Chris is going to talk a bit more about. And that is you look at what is the benefit of the drug? How valuable is this drug to the health system or to the drug plan that's going to be paying for them? Recognizing at the end of the day, of course, we as citizens and we as taxpayers pay for these drugs, but to the health budgets. And not to go into deep detail on how that is done, but there are some economic formulas that are used to determine what that price would be. At its very essence, that formula is based on how many more years of life do you get taking this drug than the next best or than the old standard of care. So as you heard from Dr. Tolas, the original standard of care, allowed patients to live to a certain age. Now we have a new drug, and it's going to allow you to live 5 years, 10 years, 20 years longer. What is the value of those additional years to the health system, maybe to the society, but oftentimes considered to be to the health system? That is what the benchmark is. And there is a number that's placed on that. So when I hear patients say to me, well, what's a life worth? I can actually say to people, quite frankly, well, I know how much your life is worth to the health system because they've got a number for it. So this is what is used to be the negotiating price. So you have these agencies like CATA, like the Quebec agency called INES. They take the drugs, they examine what the additional life years and how good those life years are, and they say, okay, here's how much, based on what the drug costs, is the actual value for each additional life year. And we will then make an assessment as to whether or not we think it's worth it. So if you are saying it's $50,000 for each additional life year, then that is what we will use to determine the price of negotiations. As you can imagine, I'm not giving you a real number because it's somewhat arbitrary. It differs from country to country. It differs from what you consider to be those economic and value-based factors. It's a bit of what John just said. It also depends on how many people might benefit from it. It depends on how many people do really well on it and how many people do not so well. So if you can imagine, I have 20 people, 10 people do well, 10 people do not. Well, the value, the number of life years, is actually half of what it would be if everybody did well. So these are the challenges we've got. Again, it's a series of economic formulas, which are not that difficult, but not worth our talking about here. What I want to get back to is what's happened now in terms of these new regulations. So in the original setup, the PMPRB, which remember, as we said, is given the mandate to make sure that Canadians aren't getting ripped off, that we're not paying more than any other country for the same drugs. So we're going to give you a maximum list price. That's your sticker price. Now, what the drug plans come back and say, but hey, how much is it really worth to us in terms of how much we're paying for other drugs, how much we can actually afford, and something really, really interesting they call, what else could we do with those drugs, in that money in the healthcare system? It's looking at what they call a cost utility. What is the opportunity cost? I can pay for patients with cystic fibrosis, or the system says I can pay for patients with diabetes. I can pay for patients for cancer. I can pay for patients with arthritis. If I have a limited amount of money, where do I get the most? And they will say this deliberately, the most bang for my buck. Do I get more life years if I treat cystic fibrosis, or do I get more life years if I take the same money, treat diabetes, treat cancer, treat heart disease? And the system actually makes those kinds of trade-offs, at least in theory. They're not actually doing it into real patients, but that's the basis of the actual economic decision making. Take all these things into consideration, and Chris is going to talk to you about how this is actually done in a negotiation fashion, and you negotiate then to say, okay, what price am I actually going to pay? You've given me a list price. You're telling me this is kind of what we think the value of it is relative to the current therapies and what else I might pay for it. Can we negotiate on a price? And that's what you heard about in Kaleidocode. You know, John said it took several years to negotiate it. All of this is a nightmare. All of this is done by the agencies, by the government. Patients have very little role in the actual negotiations, except for a submission to the assessment agency itself. It's a horrible system. Nobody likes it. There's no transparency to it. There's no consistency in it. And even worse, at the end of the day, when they negotiate a price, guess what? It's a confidential price. Nobody knows what it is. I mean, you can sometimes figure it out, but that's the way the game works. And it works in every single country, every single developed country. You go in, you have a list price, you assess what the value is, you negotiate the price. Every country does it a bit differently. However, no other country does what Canada is proposing under the new regulations. And that is they're saying, we're going to tell you what the maximum rebated price will be, what the price we will actually pay. So you don't get to negotiate anymore. We will give you a value assessment. And once we've gotten that value assessment, we will say that is the price. That is the actual price that you may pay. You may not pay more than that. The reason why this is so dangerous is, well, there's two reasons. One is that in some respects, that value-based price is, as I said, different in every country, maybe different depending on how many patients we're looking at, what you consider to be the trade-off is. As we would know, they said Kaleidocode was actually very cost effective. We give you one value assessment, but Orkambi is another assessment because there are a different number of patients involved. There are other different marginal differences. Again, it is somewhat arbitrary. The problem is also is that you cannot actually ever get to a single number. The other big problem with it, though, is the number they come up with when they do that is actually much lower than the actual, not only the list price, but the negotiated price. It is much lower than the price that any other country would be paying for that drug. So what happened in these new regulations is that the regulations say, okay, we will use an economic factor to set what we think the actual paid price is going to be. In many respects, this, in our opinion, goes way outside of the mandate of the PMPRB. You were only supposed to tell us what the non-excessive price would be. You were to only set the list price. You were not supposed to be setting what could actually be paid here. That is negotiated. So you cannot tell us what is affordable by the healthcare system. That is a different question. Beyond that, though, they set these limits, as you can see, $60,000 for each quality adjusted life year. If it's a common drug, $90,000 for each quality adjusted life year if it's a rare disease drug. So this is what they've set as the absolutely legally binding price. What it means, though, and I'll use this chart I won't belabor it much longer. You can see here on this chart, not necessarily easily, but I will kind of lead you to the high points to it. Here is where Canada is today. That's here. You can see where Switzerland and the US is. You can see where some of the other countries that are similar to us in terms of GDP, similar to us in terms of their health systems are. Japan is a good indicator. If we introduce a new basket of 11 countries, this is kind of where we're going to end up, okay? So these are the new comparative countries. We will end up about this, as you can see, if this is one, this is about 20% lower, which is kind of what the PMPRB said we wanted to do. We wanted to get down to the median. We wanted to be about 20% lower. However, what happens is if you introduce those new economic factors, which are now being done and used as the negotiating point, you now end up with them saying the maximum price that you will actually be able to get reimbursed for is down here. Basically, it's somewhat between 20 to 80% lower, with a medium around 60%. It's about what the developing European countries are paying. It's what Slovenia currently pays for drugs. So the impact is on the manufacturer, and kind of what you're seeing played out, unfortunately, with Trikafta, is that the drug manufacturers are saying, we can't come to Canada. Number one, we're not going to come to Canada, set this price at this. Even if you're not going to make this necessarily a public price, anybody can figure it out, because every other country does what we do, and that is we want our prices to be compared to the other countries, and we want to be at about the median. If suddenly Canada is here and every country which says, okay, we want that price as well, you can imagine the challenge for the drug plans, for the manufacturers. So the manufacturers are saying, we don't really want to bother coming to Canada. Remember, Canada actually is about 2% of the drug market. We actually consume 2% of patent medicines. So there's no way that they're going to say we're going to come in and allow 2% of the drug market to set what our prices are. And in many cases, companies are coming back to us and saying that is actually going to be below what we can actually afford in terms of our actual research and development manufacturing costs. We give prices like this to low-income countries as a subsidized price. There's no way we're going to subsidize Canada. It is not. And in fact, I often say, even if we could, we shouldn't be. Because we should actually be paying a premium so that other countries that are actually the low-income countries can actually get access. The other thing that's happening, of course, is that companies are saying, okay, well, let's wait until we get everybody else's prices set, and then we'll come in and we will hopefully still have us at this median price. We'll wait 6 months, a year, 2 years, 6 years. We will just wait to bring those drugs in. And as this community well knows, waiting can actually be a devastating sentence. It will be, as Dr. Tolis is saying, you're going to be treating when the patient's much more compromised. You're not going to get that function back. Not just true for cystic fibrosis, it's true for many of our rare disease drugs. And sometimes waiting actually does mean that the patient's not going to actually be surviving for that next 6 years. So this is why we're also very, very concerned with regard to these new regulations. And in fact, what we know is that drug companies are already telling us we're not bringing the drugs in. They heard about this. These were promulgated early on. We had consultations on it. And what we saw in 2019 is that the rate of drugs coming into Canada compared to the rate of new drugs coming into the US was only 15%. This is a tragedy for us certainly in the rare disease community, where sometimes these are the only therapies, the only effective therapies are definitely the best therapies. And this is a trend that is real and it's happening today. The other thing that's happening, and even though some people are saying it's not related, it's very much related. We're going to see clinical trials start to drop off, because if I can't market a drug here, if I'm not going to have access to be able to provide it to all patients for 1, 2, 6 years, I'm not going to bring my drugs in for the clinical trials, partly because there's no point to it, and partly because once I start a patient, if the drug works on a clinical trial, I have to keep that patient. So I'm going to have to be carrying that patient for another 6 years or forever until we actually decide that we're going to make those drugs available. So this is the real impact. This is why this PMPRB is so really out of line in terms of what it's doing. No other country is doing this. And we have had really very clear examples from other countries who said, we aren't even going down this route. The UK tried to introduce these similar regulatory changes back in about 2014. And there was a huge uproar. There were also clinicians and drug plans even who said this is untenable, and they pulled them back. They have not actually tried to reinstate them. We actually just picked up what was a failed proposal from 2014. And we have said in Canada, oh yeah, well, let's do that. In fact, the same researcher that actually proposed the regulations in 2014 in the UK, it's the same guy who came over from the UK and say, here, Canada, you can have these. Why don't you run with them? Which is what we've been doing. You can see the timeline that we've got here. The only thing I'm going to point to is here. Supposedly, they were going to introduce the final guidelines for how we're actually going to carry this out in spring, and that these were going to come into effect July 1. They have now announced, just as a few days ago, that this will be changed to January the 1. We will see the new draft guidelines sometime in a week and a half. It's not a reprieve. It's not over, but it will give us another 6 months to actually be able to marshal back. We need to see what the new draft guidelines said. They claim that they've listened to the patients and to the other stakeholder input. They will be coming out with different guidelines. We actually don't have any strong faith that these are going to be a whole lot better than what the previous guidelines are, but it does give us time, and it does say something very important. They're claiming that it was COVID-19 and the press of work that's forced them to delay the implementation. We also know very much that it's been the pushback from the stakeholders, not just the drug companies, who have been very strong in their concerns, but certainly the patient community, and certainly what this patient community in particular has helped to do in order to get us to this point. So the good news is that it won't be, we're not seeing an implementation date until January of next year. The bad news is that we have to continue to keep up the level of actual hard work, not just being out there, but what this webinar is all about. And I give full credit to CF Get Loud for doing this. We want you to advocate. We want you to advocate strongly, but we also want to know why this is so important for you to be advocating in this way, and what it is that we're all trying to have happen. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Durhan. That was awesome. Quick takeaways. I mean, every time that you've shared the screen, just showing the impact on studies and just the path going forward. We, as Canadians, we've always been so proud that we used to live 10 years longer than our American CFers down south, and that was the pride. And personally, I moved from Colombia in 2000 for that reason, to be at the tip of CF research and care. And our community is getting left behind, and the implications are long-term implications that we need to consider and really just work them through. So thank you for that. Up next, we have Chris McLeod. Chris is the chair of the Canadian Cystic Fibrosis Treatment Society. He works with a team of focused individuals with the objective of ensuring that patients with cystic fibrosis have access to any medication that their doctor prescribes. Chris is a natural-born fighter. He's not an outsider to the fight, as he also lives with CF and has experienced firsthand the power of breakthrough medicine. His passion is evident every time he speaks, so without further ado, I present to you Chris McLeod.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I cannot thank you enough for putting this together. This is a dream forum to see. CF Canada Get Loud. I love every single thing you guys are doing. Keep doing it, double down. Jacob, Matthew, Michael, Beth, Stephanie. If I missed anybody, you know I'm talking about all of you. Great work. I had never heard of CADIF, PCPA, any of this until I'll tell you the day, September 22nd, 2012. I'm at Ward 6B. I'd been there for weeks, plural. Call it months. 4 liters of oxygen a minute, less than 30% lung function, FEV1. We couldn't move the dial. Tolos comes in and said, Chris, long story short, there's a drug, ivacaftor. Your situation is so dire, the company's going to put you on the compassionate use program, but it's not even submitted to Health Canada, but you're in pretty rough strait. See what we can do, special access program, which became my first nemesis in this whole battle, because they denied me on the special access program. One of their terms was short-term use, Kalydeco and Trikafta cleared long-term. So ultimately, we had a big fight, and they let it through, so I went on Kalydeco. Went from 30% lung function, 4 liters, 4 of 6 months pre-Kalydeco at St.Michaels, our Ward 6B, our favorite place. I say that facetiously, to 60% lung function within certainly within 10 days, over 50%, and up to a high of 60. I'm in the mid 50s now. Now that's 7 years later where I'm sitting here. Now let's talk about CADTH and the PCPA. Let's be really quick about it. First, bit of constitutional background. I'm a lawyer by trade, so I will keep this quick. But the federal government has jurisdiction over certain pieces of work that the country does. The provinces have jurisdiction over other elements. The feds, through Health Canada, decide what drugs will come into the country and be given a DIN number, drug information number. Once it has a DIN number approved by Health Canada, it can be sold on the open market. You can buy it with cash and a doctor's prescription, private insurance, or possibly through a government provincial funded program. There's about 18,000 drugs to date that have DIN numbers. Of those 18,000, depending on the province, I think Ontario's a high water mark with about 8,200 that are listed on its provincial formulary that they would fund. Private insurance plans, robust ones, will list all of the drugs because they just charge you back on your premiums. Provinces always maintain they will never give up exclusive jurisdiction over the administration of healthcare. Administration of healthcare is a provincial job. The feds let a drug in, they give it a DIN number. Pretty much where their piece of this puzzle ends. Provinces then decide, they alone will decide what drugs are listed on their provincial formulary. This is where PCPA and CADTH come in. CADTH is a not-for-profit organization. It's owned and funded and effectively managed by the Assistant Deputy Ministers of Health of the various provinces. They treat it, when they talk to you as an advocate, as though it's a separate standalone entity, and notionally it is. It is a not-for-profit that they set up and fund to the tune of millions of dollars. They do this with, it's called that, overall it's a health HTA, Health Technology Assessment Body. They exist in all major countries have an HTA. But we've come up with a scenario now where, and I say this as a Catholic, we treat it like the papacy in the Middle Ages. It's infallible, and it's not. Provinces alone decide what drugs they list on their formulary. So once a drug has Health Canada approval, a drug company, if it wishes to have its drug potentially listed on a provincial formulary, would pay a significant fee of money to CADTH to review that drug, supposedly by an independent body. But it's like the Star Chamber. Nobody knows what goes on with this common drug review at CADTH. It's all behind closed doors. There's no open forum. You can watch the proceedings like you do in our courts of law. They'll ultimately make a recommendation at CADTH to either a recommendation to provinces that you may want to negotiate or you may not want to negotiate this particular drug based on its efficacy and its price. And they use the complex formula of quality adjusted life years, etc. But provinces do not have to listen to CADTH. It's a not-for-profit. They could listen to CF Canada. They could listen to all of us on the call. It's their choice. The ministries of health provincially and provinces always maintain that exclusive jurisdiction. So CADTH, that's why CADTH only makes a recommendation, regardless of what that recommendation is. But if it's a yes, like it was with ivacaftor, provinces could negotiate on their own. But what they've done, and it is prudent, they all come together under an umbrella called the PCPA. It's a notional body, but really all it is the provinces saying together, we'll negotiate as one unit with a drug company and get a price listing agreement, a set low price that then each of the provinces can choose or not to choose to implement over a 3-year period. Again, PCPA and CADTH, whenever you're going to speak to your MPPs, your MLAs, the Premier, the Health Minister, they talk as though these are separate entities they have no control over. PCPA gets its direction from ministries of health and ADMs. CADTH is effectively owned as a not-for-profit by the deputy ministers of health of all the provinces. They get their funding from the provinces. Their board of directors at CADTH is made up of the assistant deputy ministers who run the drug plan as the majority of the board. Common drug review. Those people are all appointed within that body. So premise one, there's no problem having an independent review in principle, but treating it as the holy grail that will decide whether you enter or not into a negotiation is a failed point in my view. But and the PCPA negotiates, having one negotiation on behalf of all provinces, that makes sense. But saying that you don't have control over when that body goes into negotiations or not would not be an accurate statement. If the Minister of Health directs the PCPA to negotiate and the PCPA doesn't, then the Ministry of Health in a given province can do its own price listing agreement with the pharmaceutical company. So I've always viewed, and well, first of all, I believe that they're both government actors, therefore subject to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which gets into some issues with lawsuits, one in BC we've launched. But the backdrop is PCPA negotiates on behalf of all provinces. Whatever deal it negotiates is valid for a province to choose to accept or not, because provinces have never ceded, nor will they ever, exclusive and ultimate jurisdiction over what drugs they pay for and what ones they don't. So I don't want to go into much more because we could talk literally for hours about these two entities. And I want to stay positive and focused. So with the great work of CF Get Loud, CF Canada, and every family and patient raising your voice, continue to do what everyone's doing. Go to your elected officials, the Minister of Health. Ultimately, it's the Minister of Health that can decide whether to negotiate through the PCPA or negotiate alone. And in any event, whatever agreement is negotiated, they decide whether they implement it. They decide what they do with the healthcare dollars that are under their control. It's in the Constitution. You won't find PCPA or CADF anywhere in the Canadian Constitution. It's the it's the province that runs the jurisdiction of healthcare. And we've created these as entities that are immovable. It's a not-for-profit organization founded in the early 2000s, for crying out loud. So why don't we maybe answer questions, Jacob?
Yeah. You've already fed us with so much. I'm sure, and I see already on the chat and previous questions that we'll ask of you a little bit later in the program. But thank you for that, Chris. Again, you're always so passionate about it. It fires me up every time. I think big takeaways here for me, and I assume the group as well. The question of jurisdiction and if there's a health assessment board that makes a recommendation, now we're having the struggle between the power to not only mandate but also recommend. And I think the passing the buck, if I might use that expression, is quite accurate for what we're in. And you were very, very good to highlight these bodies are not, they don't have an extensive track record. They're fresh and they're operated, owned, funded, directed by the very people that are shifting responsibility over to these bodies. So thank you for that, Chris. Up next, we have Beth Vanstone. So Beth is one of the directors of CF Get Loud Canada. Beth is mom to a daughter with CF and a longtime advocate. She is no stranger to this fight. In the past, she has advocated for newborn screening and was instrumental to in the fight to secure public funding for Kaleidocope. Her energy has touched me on a personal level that she has earned the nickname The Hammer amongst the group due to her perspective and candor that she brings to every conversation that we have. So Beth, on to you.
Thank you. Firstly, I want to say how humbling it is to be on a panel of such amazing and esteemed speakers. I look to each one of them as heroes in their individual battles, and it's really exciting to be on here and be able to speak with them as part of the panel. So I wanted to begin to just say that patient advocates, we're all advocates, and the next few minutes with you, I'm going to just let you know that we can all do this, each and every one of us. Like I said, we're born advocates. From our first cries, we are advocating for ourselves. Yes, we are indeed born to speak up. As we go through life, we advocate in many different situations. We advocate to ourselves at school. We advocate for children at our doctor's appointments and later as patients at those doctor's appointments. Many of you advocate each and every day when you're asking for donations for specific charities. If you look at your own lives, I'm sure you will see that when it is important, you can and you will speak up. Advocating for access to medication is just another level of advocacy. So our journey began with a hand-colored sign and a passion to fight for what was right. Here it is, the night before our first trip to Queen's Park. It was the first action step in our fight to get public funding for Maddie and other CF patients who would benefit from Kaleido, the first CFTR modulator. Maddie pulled out her markers and colored some signs, while I pulled out Google Maps to figure out how to get to Queen's Park. And that's how our journey began. We are not alone. MPPs, MPs, patient organizations, and journalists can all become allies in this fight. Knowing you are not alone is huge when it comes to this battle. Whether you know it or not, you have many supports available to help you along the way. We have representatives from organizations speaking today that have resources and answers to questions you may have. Today's town hall was organized by CF Canada Get Loud in order to provide support in your efforts. Although it may not feel like it all the time, MPPs, MLAs, and MPs are also here for you. As an advocate, it is your job to garner that support. People should, I repeat, people should come before politics. It's that simple. It's not your job to fix an imperfect system, and this one is certainly imperfect. It is, however, your job to explain your story and ensure that whoever you are sharing your story with understands that access to life-saving medications should not be this difficult. I have found that it is not always easy, but when what you are advocating for is the right thing, it can be accomplished. It's all in the relationships. Building relationships with people is so very important. Meeting with people and sharing your story, calling them and keeping them up to date on the situation, particularly how your patient. Politicians will care if you make them part of your experience. Our MPP, Jim Wilson, not only became part of our story, but also part of the story of the fight for CF medications. Many years have passed, as you can see in the photo, Maddie has worn out her jeans, but we are forever grateful to Jim for his unwavering support in our community. Journalists, in a large part, become writers to be able to help people and evoke positive change. There are many journalists who have walked this walk with us and continue to share our stories and struggles, educating the public on what is happening with changes to the Canadian drug policies that affect all Canadians, as well as the very important patient stories. Your fight matters. We're fighting for our lives here. There is nothing more important than that. Do not ever feel that you're annoying the government, the media outlets, or anyone else you're reaching out to in order to achieve your ultimate goal. Whether you're advocating for access through a compassionate program, as Steph Stavros did, which led to her being the first to access Trikafta in Canada through that program, or you're fighting policy changes that are stopping life-saving medications that will save you or your loved ones, it does matter. Most important in your battle is your story. Share your story. Stay positive, and it's certainly okay to be firm. Sharing the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's all relative. CF is tough. Explain the impact of the disease on the patient, on other children in your family, and on your relationships. It is important to remain positive and respectful. Despite the frustration you will undoubtedly feel, and you will, proceed through this journey. Always try and keep calm and respectful and in a professional manner as much as you can during this struggle. Feel confident to push back. You certainly do not have to accept everything they tell you in a meeting as gospel. In most situations, you will be more informed than the person you are speaking to on the situation. It is a Canadian problem. This is your story, but our efforts are on behalf of not just CM patients. in the cases of the changes to the PMPRB. This is not just about Trikafta, but about all new drugs currently being held at the border by changes to the PMPRB. Explaining to whoever you are sharing with how, although you are advocating for your specific medications, all Canadians are affected by these policies. Make this battle inclusive rather than exclusive. By including how, although your situation is personal to you and your community, the policy surrounding access to drugs in Canada affects all Canadians. It is important that as you share your story, you also enlighten your audience that although it is currently a struggle you are facing, it very well could be them in the near future. We are stronger together. In 2013, Maddie and I were joined at Queen's Park by MPP Jim Wilson and Maddie's teacher and classmates. That was our little posse. Earlier this year, Jim joined us again with a group of CF moms, CF patients, CF dads, who were also joining the fight. We are stronger together. Remember, you are not alone. The current drug Trikafta is life-changing for 90% of the CF population. The changes to the PMPRB will affect all Canadians, so many are fighting alongside you. Looking back to the battle we waged for Kalydeco, which sadly was only effective in 5% of the CF population, which is already a rare disease, you can imagine we didn't have even close to the numbers that have engaged in this battle. It is awe-inspiring to see people from across Canada taking actions daily in efforts to gain access to Trikafta. Life-saving drugs are worth the fight. There is light at the end of the tunnel. After nearly 2 years of advocating, Kalydeco was covered in Ontario and within a few months, other provinces across Canada. Anything worth having is worth fighting for. It's true. Be prepared for the long haul. We are here until we get this done. It is tough and it's frustrating. However, know that we are a large group committed to ensuring patients will get what they are due. So if you feel exhausted, feel free to take a step back while the group continues to push forward and then come back refreshed. Goals. Here we are, from IV poles to hiking poles. We are seeing amazing results in patients around the world from the modulators we need to access so desperately. People are coming off transplant lists and getting back to work. Children are seeing the devastation on their bodies halted by these medications. On top of gains to their lung function, they are getting back to school, sports, and living lives as children should. In Maddie's situation, she was transformed from a very sick little girl suffering from chronic headaches, stomach issues, sinus infections, and a quickly dropping lung function while living a large portion of her life from the couch, to an active young woman who spent 5 days trekking the Great Wall of China last September and is excitedly planning a future none of us thought she would have. Kalydeco has indeed not only saved her life, but put a lot of living back into that life. CF Get Loud is proud to be supporting efforts by advocates across Canada by sharing and amplifying their initiatives. We are excited to see CF Canada, CORD, and the CF Treatment Society coming together today to raise our voices in an effort to ensure patients across Canada will have access to the medications they need. We are indeed stronger together. Thank you.
Oh, Beth, thank you for that. That was so powerful. Honestly, every time I hear you speak, I just get more fired up, and I'm sure this has definitely resonated with our audience today. I find that staying positive in this fight is it's certainly a challenge, and I think I truly believe that our community gathering together and joining together helps with the emotional toll that not just fighting for your health, but fighting for access takes on everybody. So thank you for adding a little bit of positivity and hope to what looks to be not an insurmountable mountain, but just a marathon. Chris always brings me down and reminds me that this is a marathon and not a sprint. So thank you for injecting us with some hope. I'd like to, I guess at this point, move on to our call to action. So we're here, and now what? So we have learned from the experts. Hopefully you have learned more about the issues at hand. We're confident that after understanding what Trikafta means for the CF community, the path forward is clear. We need to do everything in our power to bring this medication to Canadians living with CF. We have been fighting our whole lives, by ourselves, within ourselves, alongside our families and loved ones, and our care teams to slow down the deterioration of this disease. Excuse me. We all have a role in this fight, and I ask you, whoever you are listening right now, to do your part and help us. So for MPs that are listening, we respectfully ask that you continue to press the Minister of Health to rescind the changes to the PMPRB. These changes hurt all Canadians. The Special Access Program is not a path for access. Please correct her and request that she expedite the process to bring Trikafta to Canada. MPPs and MLAs, we ask that you continue to pressure your provincial Minister of Health to instruct the PCPA to begin official negotiations with Vertex. There have been 6 unsolicited offers without constructive feedback. This position is not productive towards getting medication to patients. Provinces are also able to negotiate individually on behalf of their constituents, so carve out the path forward if necessary. Media, continue to ask the tough questions for politicians. Call out the misinformation being shared. Please continue to share patients' stories. We are in the fight for our lives, and we need you to amplify our struggle and our voices. And advocates, create new relationships and continue working on the connections you have already made, good and not so good. Regroup and revisit them. Call and update those that you have reached out and update them on how you or your loved one is faring as they battle CF. Explain where we are in the fight for medication. Ask what they have done to support your efforts and what they are planning to do. Speak to your MPs, your MPPs, your MLAs, and all media to share your story about living with this disease and the challenges ahead. We will definitely have another defined call to action once the PMPRB guidelines are released mid-June, and we hope to work with you as a community to bring about change. So work on those relationships so we are ready to go. Working together as a team, we are stronger together. At this point, I would like to move to the question period. We've had so many questions come in, so forgive me if we don't get to the questions that you've sent. I know Durhand has done pretty good work also answering within the chat module itself. We will keep a list of these questions and hopefully post a resource so that everybody's questions are answered. Maybe starting with Dr. Tellis, there's been a lot of questions regarding the Special Access Program and trials for pediatric use of Trikafta, and also what other clinics around Canada are doing to move the needle, or anything that they're doing to gain access or allow patients to have access to this medication. Dr. Tellis?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you for the question. That was a tremendous town hall. I found it very inspiring, but I also found it was great to have like everything all together so that you could sort of follow through all the challenges. I think that the CF community of healthcare professionals plays a big role here, and part of that is just helping educate people, educating our patients about the issues. Patients know an awful lot about CF and they know about treatments, but they don't necessarily understand the process, the things we heard today. I think that this, being connections or helping people with CF connect and encouraging them to connect with other people with CF, and also encouraging people. I'm always surprised that people say to me, well, why don't you go and talk to the government, because they'll listen to you because you're a doctor. And so the answer is I do go and talk to the government, but I realize that I'm not as effective as people with CF and their families, that you're a more powerful voice here than the medical professionals. Now, we do have the compassionate program, and CF Canada has been helpful in providing sort of connection between the clinics who, we all talk, and there is a way of connecting with CF Canada. And so we're all here to help each other in terms of answer questions and to try and get people who are eligible to be on Trikafta access to the compassionate program. So that is happening, and that's important. So I think that, you know, we're part of the community, and we have some certain jobs to like a role to play, but it works best if we're all working together.
Just for those that are listening, if you know, I think you've made it clear, and hopefully our audience understands that this is not a path to access, and compassionate, the very word itself, hints at it's end of life care. This is language that is used for the dire needs. If there are people that are listening that are at that stage, what is their first step or first couple of steps to look into hopefully gaining access via this program?
So I think the first step is speaking to your team, your physicians, your nurse coordinator. They have information from CF Canada. They have information about the program, and they have the connections of other physicians across the country. It's a complex program to get access. There's contracts and forms to fill out, and it isn't easy in all hospitals to do. But we can certainly share some of the tips that we've found to be helpful. So the first step is going to your physician and your medical team and asking the questions: how do I get access? Am I eligible? And if the team doesn't know about it, I think that this is where best comment about respectful continuing to question is important. Is that you don't just say okay, you keep asking until you get answers that sort of make sense. And so I think that the dialogue starts there, but we're all here to help each other. So all the programs are here to help the other programs.
Thank you for that. The next question is for Durhan. And you've made it clear that this isn't about just CF or even rare disease for that matter. There's a question about how these new PMPRB changes will affect already approved drugs here in Canada. So that is number one. And number two, do you feel that Trikafta is perhaps, you've used the language tip of the spear, but the perfect drug to lead the charge challenging these proposed guidelines? Sorry, Durhan, you're still muted. Give me 1 second. Hopefully Devin can, yeah.
I got it, sorry, yeah. So the first part of the question is very important, and I didn't want to go to all the details of the way in which the proposed changes are, but not only will they affect the drugs that are actually on already in Canada, but the proposal is that they will reassess these drugs. And over a period of time, they will continuously reassess the drugs, but also new drugs coming in will be reassessed on a periodic basis. So as more countries make these drugs available, they'll reassess the pricing. As they get more data around how many patients are using the drugs, and the sad news is that the more patients are using the drugs, the more likely is that they will want to actually reduce the price on the drugs, even though it may have greater value. So this is a big challenge for the companies as well. They do not want to have no predictability. They set their budgets. They want to be able to say, this is how much money I'm going to make. But if in fact they're vulnerable to saying, hey, we think you'll make this much money, but in reality, we're going to reassess it every few years, companies again are going to hesitate. So that's really important. In terms of Trikafta being a perfect drug for this kind of mission, it definitely has the data. Nobody would doubt that, this is, of all the drugs that have come forth, right, is that combination which actually could make a huge difference. If one were to actually do honest, health technology assessment, cost effectiveness, there's no doubt about it that this would come up, heads up, hands down, right? The winner in terms of all the therapies that are there, and absolutely, would be able to have a strong impact. The challenge will be, on the good news is that there's a whole lot of patients that could benefit. The bad news is from the drug plan's point of view, oh my God, there's a whole bunch of patients we're going to have to pay for. So this is a real challenge in terms of the strange ways that our drug plans make. I would think what makes it a perfect drug, does have good data, has a very strong advocacy community behind it. The docs are willing to speak. Not in every case do we have physicians who are willing to go to bat. You know, they go back for their patients, but they will not necessarily challenge the government. So we're in a great position. I honestly do believe that Trikafta will get there. What you want to do is get it there sooner rather than later. And I think that's it. The Compassionate Access Program is a double-edged sword. It obviously will open up the gateway. It will have more patients who are going to be treated. Obviously great for the patients. Put more pressure on the drug plans to make it available to everybody. But it is something that the drug plans are willing to say, okay, companies, you take the most desperate patients. You take those that are, really need it. Take the pressure off of us in terms of, so the important thing is if you get access, you need to become the loudest advocates.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We're a little tight for time here, so I'm going to do my best to just ask at least just one or two questions from each speaker. Like I said to our audience, we'll get these answers to you, so stay tuned. But so maybe on to John. John, what do you? I know that CF Canada and the struggle for research, innovation, and development of these drugs has been primarily funded by your organization. And how do you overcome the frustration when perhaps government mentions that these drugs were partially funded in research by you, and how do you bridge this gap of being instrumental in the research of the gene, the discovery of the gene, and going forward, and then finding ourselves at this end of the marathon and just short of it?
Well, Jacob, thanks for that. It is incredibly frustrating. I must admit, certainly, these drugs wouldn't exist without having had the discovery of the gene, as Dr. Tillis pointed out earlier. But just for clarification, we as CF Canada wasn't specifically involved or did not partially fund the development of these drugs in particular. This was largely supported, however, by a patient organization, both the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation in the United States. And even there, when patient organizations do go into something called venture philanthropy, where they're investing in actual drug development, often through companies, startup companies or whatnot, they will see a return on the sales of those drugs, but they really don't have a lot of influence over the companies themselves. Bear in mind, Vertex is, we might have mixed feelings about the company because we look at the cost of these drugs and we do see it as very high, and that is a barrier. And the government certainly of late have certainly historically haven't had a very good relationship with the company. The company has been quite aggressive. But in spite of all of the challenges that the company has had in getting these drugs approved in countries around the world, if you look at how they are perceived on Wall Street, they are Wall Street darlings. This is a company that is extremely highly well rated by investors. And so we're confronting a situation which is a little peculiar, because if you look at, something that Dr. Tillis mentioned earlier, the cell phones. Well, if people aren't happy with a particular cell phone company, or they can live without a product, they just don't buy the product. There's direct feedback from the consumer community to the manufacturer. In the case of drugs, that's not the case. Patients don't choose their own drugs. They're prescribed to them by patients or by their doctors. They typically don't pay for them. It's drug systems like we've been talking today that pay for them. So that direct consumer feedback, the levers that consumers might have over a typical company, don't really exist with the pharmaceutical industry, and it creates an odd environment that is different from what you see in normal things. The other, I did want to just address one thing really quickly about the notion that Trikafta is sort of this bellwether of a class of drugs. And Dr. Tullis had mentioned it earlier about this being a class of drugs called precision medicines. And you might have heard about personalized medicine or precision medicine. And that is really medicine, drugs that are developed based on a good understanding or a very deep understanding of the biology of a disease. And some of the examples, one of the examples I've used a lot is when I was a child growing up, breast cancer was breast cancer. Everybody got treated the same. Now it's 20 different diseases. They have different prognoses. They have different approaches for treatment, and some of them have targeted therapies, and they're much smaller populations. And it's true. You can even see that within cystic fibrosis already, which is a rare disease, because if you look at the different modulators, they don't treat everybody with cystic fibrosis. They have, we are breaking the patient population down into smaller categories. Kalydeco was about 5%, or Orkambi was about 50%. Now, Trikafta, we're fortunate, it's up to 90%. But by nature of these drugs, you look at smaller and smaller populations because you're understanding the biology so precisely. And what's important is that that's the future of medicine. And so, as in cancer, as we get better and better at understanding disease in general, and we get more precise drugs, the populations that they treat become smaller, and those drugs look more like rare disease drugs. So the fact that we're having challenges with Trikafta and barriers, and because we see a relatively high price because the population is small, there's a risk that this is going to be a problem for all of these innovative drugs moving forward.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's very important. I want to be mindful of time, so we must stop at 2:50. So I want to get in a question for Chris, because you alluded to some legal action that you have going, and I think that adds a little bit of perspective to our community. I know it's not a quick solution for the nature of a legal process, but can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Okay, so we have two lawsuits or legal proceedings ongoing at the moment. One is a class action in British Columbia against the British Columbia government. You can only sue one province in a province. I can't sue Ontario and BC. So we've decided to proceed in British Columbia, suing BC, the federal government, CAT, and the PCPA for, there's two heads of the claim or the action. Violation of Section 7, Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. It was Section 7 that gave rise to doctor-assisted suicide. You have a Section 7 right to medical assistance in dying. You have a Section 7 right for clean needles in the Insight case. We say that there's CADF and the PCPA and the provinces and the feds have violated Section 7 by not that they have to fund every single drug, but that you need a clear, transparent, evidence-based process that's clear to all and for funding of drugs. And tied to that is the tort of conspiracy, in that it was a coordinated effort between the various provinces and the feds to violate the charter right. So that's one, it's ongoing. That has two representative plaintiffs, so I don't go into a lot of detail on what's going on because the two plaintiffs and their particular cases are tied in with that. The one I can speak of more fully is it's a lawsuit commenced in the province of Quebec by 5 pharmaceutical companies challenging the jurisdiction of the federal government to implement the regulatory amendments to the PMPRB. As I said, feds do certain things, provinces administer healthcare. The argument in that lawsuit is that the feds are now moving into provincial jurisdiction. They are impeding the ability of provinces to administer healthcare because of these onerous regulations. The CF Treatment Society intervened in that case, and in Quebec, unlike the other provinces, you can actually intervene and effectively become a party to the proceeding and adduce evidence. We were granted, I can't remember now whether it was December or January, I think it was December, we were granted leave to intervene by the court in Quebec. So we are now effectively a party in that case. We have affidavit evidence. I've sworn an affidavit. Dr. Tullis has. We have 2 other CF patients that have sworn affidavits. There'll be reply affidavits from the government. Then we will argue that case at first instance at trial. September 28th, I think, is the date set for the hearing. Date is not being moved at this point because of COVID. It'll be a virtual hearing. We'll give further updates so that people can watch. I obviously encourage any other group to try and intervene. The more the merrier. There are 2 other interveners, the Intellectual Patent Organization. So there's a jurisdictional case in BC that we're involved with, and then the class action in BC on Section 7 of the Charter.
Thank you, Chris. Sorry, we are sadly out of time, and I know we could talk about this forever. And it's not just to you, Chris, but to the rest of our panel. And sorry that we didn't get to a question for you. There were lots, but like I said, we will make all these questions and answers available on our channels, on our website, Facebook group, etc. Thank you so much for joining us, all our panelists. This has been incredible. We hope that everybody has understood the obstacles standing between our CF community and life-changing medication, because it's not about saving lives, it's about allowing patients to regain their lives. So thank you so much for joining us, and we're all here to support each other. So thank you.